Today, if I could, I'd like to reflect again, and I know this is sort of a habit, on Sunday's Gospel, yesterday's Gospel. If you were at 9:30 or the noon, you heard some of this reflection anyway, but I think that it's something worth carrying maybe into our week. This Sunday's Gospel was Mark's version of the temptation in the desert. And Mark gives a very, very brief description as compared to Matthew and to Luke, where in Matthew and Luke there's this dialogue with Satan and this back and forth between Satan and Jesus, whereas Mark's gospel simply says he was driven into the wilderness, tempted by Satan, lived with the wild animals, was tended by the angels, and that was it. And I love the brevity of Mark's gospel, because the focus, I think, then just simply becomes the desert, which is the archetype, I'm going to say, or the great symbol of isolation. And isolation we all experience. And of course, it's reminiscent of the 40 years the Israelites wandered in the desert. And as I reflect on this experience of isolation, of loneliness that we all experience at parts of our lives, and sometimes, especially in this day and age, more often than we'd like to, I can't help but think, and bear with me, of this song by the Counting Crows. I think it was written in like the early or mid 90s. Mrs. Potter's Lullaby is the name of the song. And there's this line in it that kept coming to me this week, and it says, "I dream I never know anyone at the party, and I'm always the host." How many of us experience isolation even in the crowded worlds that we live in? How many of us experience loneliness even when we're surrounded by people? How many of us experience isolation even sometimes when we're laying right next to our own spouse, simply because I feel at that moment in time that the people around me just don't get me, don't get what I experience, don't get what I'm going through? How many of our children experience isolations right in the families they live in? They can't go 5 steps without bumping into a brother or a sister, and yet somehow they feel alone because they feel at times forgotten, unheard, unrecognized, or they just feel like misunderstood. This experience goes into our workplaces. We can be surrounded by people at work and still feel lonely and still feel isolated. Social gatherings, although they're rare, I realize in this time. The lunch tables in our high school could be crowded with kids. One kid at the end not saying a word, his isolation sort of being worn on his sleeve. The kid at the other end yelling at the top of his lungs, cracking jokes and all that, still experiencing isolation, although hiding it in the form of hubris. All that to be said is that we have to claim this isolation as we enter into this Lenten season, that part of us is always sort of perpetually alone. We were fired into this world by the breath of God, and we'll never in one way experience true completeness until we encounter Him on the other side in the beatific vision. The good news in all this is Lent gives us the opportunity to embrace, to name, and to claim this isolation, to go out into the desert. And now back to Jesus's desert experience. I'm going to argue that this was and is the ongoing experience of Jesus in the incarnation, of Jesus taking on flesh, of Jesus wanting to enter more deeply into our broken humanity. That He even intentionally, because the Spirit sends Him out into the desert, this is an intentional thing, goes out into the desert not just to be tempted, but to encounter us even in our own isolation. So as we go through this Lent, which is just beginning, we give up things, we fast, we do penitential acts. Some of these things we feel like they seem even more burdensome this year because we feel like the last year has been sort of a Lent or a penitential season. So I'm going to suggest that maybe one of the things we can do is encounter, embrace, and claim that feeling of alienation, of isolation, and of loneliness that we all experience at times. We can't escape it. But when we claim it, we go out into the desert, completely alone in one way, but also completely open. And we find that Jesus Christ was there all along. When we experience isolation, we turn to all different kinds of things to anesthetize it. Alcohol, drugs, the internet, all forms of social media, shopping, any addiction you can name. because we're trying to hide from this experience that's part of our humanity. This Lent, if we go out into the desert and acknowledge that we feel isolated, we feel lonely at times, this then becomes, instead of a bad thing, an opportunity for an encounter with Jesus Christ. That even when there's nothing around me that makes sense, and I am completely lonely, I offer that up to God, and there I encounter Jesus Christ. And I encounter who I truly am, not some false version of myself. And then having gone out into the desert, I can return to life free to love, free to give of myself, free to share of myself over and over and over again, because I know that even when things seem to be taken away from me, they can't take it all, because at the core of it is this relationship with Jesus Christ. And having gone out to the desert and saying, I sought and I found, I know he is with me always. This gives me a great freedom in this life to share with others without worrying about being taken from. The desert experience returns us to the world knowing that we can never be truly alone if we've encountered Jesus Christ. And then we go out into the world, into other people's isolation, other people's loneliness. We share this same experience, and people, along with ourselves, begin to feel whole again. May God's love be with you always. I hope you have a very peaceful and holy Lent, and I hope to see you all very soon.